Story 1. I am Indian. Online, there are different camps. People who generally have a favorable opinion of Russia and its leadership due to historic ties tend to believe that Ukraine is at fault. People who acknowledge that Russia is the aggressor but want India to remain neutral and trade with everyone. People who mildly support Ukraine. People who are pro-West and overwhelmingly support Ukraine. They advocate for changing our foreign policy. People who are on the left and anti-West think it is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's fault. In real life, most people do not know much about Ukraine or care about it. Most Indians do not care about Russia either. It is just a large country far to the north. Perhaps it was different during the Cold War or even the 1990s, but Russia does not have much cultural influence now. National media that supports the government tends to lean pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine, and defends our right to trade with anyone we choose, depending on one's perspective. Story 2. The news outlet reports Russia as the aggressor and maintains an objective tone. That has not changed since the war started. Story 3. When it first happened, there was a lot of talk about it in Bangladesh, but I don't think much else was discussed beyond the first year. Western news doesn't cover it often, except for when it dominates the headlines. Thank you for asking this question. I have been wondering what other countries are doing about this issue. My country also abstained from the vote. I understand why we aren't really global players. Story 4. Official news from television, newspapers, and reputable news sites is similar to that in the West, but Indonesia is largely neutral and advocates for peace. YouTube news, on the other hand, often seems to defend Russia. Do you mean Asia, specifically Japan, China, and Korea? Story 5. I am Indian. Russia has been portrayed as the aggressor since the start of the war, but there are also articles published on the importance of Indo-Russian relations because they are, unfortunately, our only ally on the continent. The general consensus is to sympathize with Ukraine while refraining from being openly critical of Putin. Story 6. I don't live in Asia anymore, so I cannot talk from personal experience. I can, however, share what my father told me very bluntly. I had asked him why India was choosing to refine Russian oil when all this had started. I come from a Western perspective since I have lived in the United States for a long time. My father simply reminded me that the average person in India makes less than $10 per day. This person also pays more for petrol than the average person in the United States, who likely makes 10 times more in salary. Next, he reminded me that even missing one day of work for a majority of the population in India would be a death sentence for their families or, at the very least, lead to significant hardship for missing even one day's pay. Therefore, there is no room for protesting because even if they wanted to, they cannot afford it. Then he asked me what the average Indian citizen should do to make the general public in the United States happy, to which I had no answer. Give up using petrol? They can't do that. Protest? They can't do that either. It's not financially feasible. He also reminded me that United States government officials were aware and fully supportive of India buying Russian oil. So I guess it's complicated. Story 7. Both South Korean media and the public are supportive of Ukrainians and are aware of some of the most infamous war crimes and massacres committed by Russia against Ukraine, aside from some conspiracy theorists. The majority of homophobes and social conservatives that Russia seeks to influence are young men who may be drafted to face the North Korean threat, as well as older Christians who have been aligned with the United States since the Korean War. However, South Korea is dealing with a constitutional crisis regarding President Yoon and his declaration of martial law, and recent developments have limited public attention on this issue. Story 8. In my country, the public and news rarely discuss it, and when they do, they only focus on updates regarding diplomacy and generally maintain a neutral stance. Story 9. Malaysians are often anti-West. While we remain mostly neutral, we tend to lean slightly towards Russia, especially given the support for the Palestinian plight by the United States. Now that Trump seems to like Putin, I believe we are just confused and unsure about what is happening. Story 10. Citizens are more supportive of Ukraine, but the news and government are more supportive of China and Russia. News companies often take the easy route by sourcing information from Fox News, so there are no surprises. Story 11. In India, as mentioned earlier in the post, the media favors Russia due to historical ties. Even those with left-leaning views understand Russia's position and, at best, do not support it. No one is openly opposing Russia. I personally dislike Russian aggression, as it sets a bad precedent for the world, suggesting that if you have cultural or historical ties, you can simply invade and take the land. Before anyone criticizes me, do you care about the war crimes committed in Armenia by Azerbaijan? Or the way the Kurds are being killed in Syria by Turkey? Story 12. My country is close to Asia, and the government openly supports Ukraine by supplying arms and aid. We comply with sanctions against Russia and oppose its aggression. Many of my colleagues are from China, and when I ask them about their views, they generally seem somewhat sympathetic toward Ukraine. However, the biggest issue is their embarrassment and disappointment with Russia, which they view as weak and shameful. Story 13. In India, there are definitely a few television channels under Russian payroll. But overall, at least around me, people are neutral and would rather not see this situation escalate into a nuclear exchange. We stood by and watched as Western forces brought freedom and democracy to many places. I suppose we will stand by and observe the Russian special operation as well. Not that we lack empathy, but we are in no position to interfere. Just a few decades ago, the United States wanted to flatten our eastern seaboard, and now they want to sell us their fighter jets. There are no permanent friends or enemies. Story 14. We give no attention to the Russian channels on TV spreading propaganda. We just find it amusing. Story 15. Wife and her family are from Vietnam. Many are here in the United Kingdom, but there are also quite a few in Vietnam itself. They largely do not seem to care either way. They are just getting on with their lives and are indifferent to Donald Trump because, as a socialist myself, they largely see him as no different from any other United States president. As a result, there is no real concern about the war in Ukraine and Trump's latest attempts to end it or possibly make it worse. If the situation between Ukraine and Russia were to escalate and turn into a world war, Vietnam would likely be a safe place anyway, so it would be the same for them as a conflict between Timor-Leste and Indonesia would be for us in the West. Story 16. We have historically been non-aligned. The people primarily want peace in Ukraine, but we have maintained a strong trade relationship with Russia, which will continue regardless of the events in the conflict. That being said, our Prime Minister will seize any opportunity to promote himself as a savior, having already released questionable advertisements claiming he stopped the war. Story 17. Oh, I just unlocked a memory. I am European but was on a trip to India last December. At Mumbai Airport, there were several screens displaying a news update stream. I am not aware of more context, but I surely hope this was a Bollywood parody and not actual news coverage. Story 18. Supportively, ever since Ukraine sided with us, before that, no one apart from the Russian Ukrainian-speaking community, like me for example, cared about the war, even siding with Putin. Story 19. As a South African, I observed that most people in South Africa support Ukraine. However, our government seems to favor Russia. Story 20. The claim that China reported on the situation in a neutral way is not true. The Chinese government aggressively defends Russia and portrays Ukraine as the villain, with the West as the ultimate culprit. In the initial hours of the conflict, Chinese social media was celebrating. State media uncritically repeated Russian sources, spreading claims that Kyiv would fall within 1 hour and 22 minutes. People cheered this narrative. Anyone who tried to defend Ukraine faced accusations of being Western lapdogs. Even expressing sympathy for Ukrainian civilians or calling for peace led to labels of hypocrisy, with people shouting, "Did you pray for the children in Gaza and Syria?" It did not matter whether you did or not. The goal was to delegitimize any sympathy for Ukraine simply because it is supported by the West. Even before former President Trump accused President Zelensky of dragging Ukraine into war, Chinese discourse was already blaming him. Things improved slightly as the war dragged on, primarily because Russia did not achieve a quick victory. However, this shift was not a moral awakening. It was more a sentiment of disappointment, with the attitude of, "I thought you were strong enough to teach the West a lesson." Story 21. Our Prime Minister stopped the war about a year ago. The mainstream media covered this story for a month straight. Guess my country. Story 22. Who is the source? Pro-Russian sources claim that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is to blame and that Russia had no choice. Pro-Western sources assert that Vladimir Putin simply wants to restore the Soviet Union. Honestly, it is unfortunate that there is no truth anymore, only alliances. Story 23. What is the point of asking this here anyway? Anything remotely contrary would get immediately downvoted into oblivion. I can see it happening right now. Story 24. In India, the government and government-sponsored news outlets claim it was Ukraine's mistake and that they deserve it. Story 25. Nobody here cares. We don't care about Russia, and we certainly don't care about Ukraine. The Palestine-Israel conflict is more important to us. You may not see much about the Palestine conflict in your media, similar to how we see little coverage of the situation regarding Russia. Story 26. I am from Argentina, so while I'm not from Asia, I would like to share my perspective. In general, news outlets tend to align with whatever the United States supports, which is why they were decidedly pro-Ukraine. However, since Trump, I haven't heard much about the war in support of either side. Online, there are three groups regarding the conflict. The first group is pro-Ukraine, viewing Putin as a villain and his soldiers in a very negative light. The second group is pro-Putin, blaming the United States and the United Nations for their actions in Eastern Europe and claiming that Ukraine is a fascist or pseudo-Nazi country, arguing that Putin is merely defending his territory. The third group occupies a more centrist position, blaming both sides and advocating for neutrality. They argue that this conflict is just the latest iteration of the proxy wars between the United States and Russia, viewing both sides as empires striving to dominate their rivals without any clear reason to support either one. Story 27. Vietnam. Somewhat dependent. In the beginning, they followed Russian propaganda. Russia is not going to invade Ukraine. The military gathering is just for demonstration, and the United States is only an alarmist. Ukraine will fall in 3 days. After Ukraine's success in reclaiming some regions, they presented more Ukraine-favorable viewpoints. Currently, there are again viewpoints favoring Russia. Most of the time, they publish news about Russian drones destroying Western equipment in Ukraine. For anything more substantial or analytical, they usually copy from Western sources. Even the so-called expert interviews, Dang the Mao, strategic expert, provide little meaningful information, often being less informative than some YouTubers. At this time, Donald Trump and related matters are also in focus. Story 28. Hello, I'm Pakistani. Russia is the bad guy here. I'm not sure what the majority of the country thinks because I don't follow politics or any news. I've never participated in or heard a discussion from fellow countrymen on this topic. I don't have any personal opinions because I lack extensive knowledge on this subject. Story 29. Not from Japan, but I am a long-term resident. Russia is shown as the clear aggressor, and the suffering of the Ukrainian people is a major focal point of the news coverage. There is an occasionally voiced understanding that allowing Russia to invade Ukraine with insufficient consequences would set a precedent that threatens the security of Japan and the stability of East Asia. The government's defense white paper outlining the increase in military spending stated that Ukraine represents the future of Asia and consistently warned about the threat of countries attempting to change the status quo by force. Story 30. Official stance. Russia is an aggressor. Talk amongst the people. Ukraine faced consequences due to political missteps. Story 31. Divided. The older generations believe Russia has historical rights to Ukraine, while younger generations value Ukraine's right to sovereignty and self-rule as an independent state. Additionally, there are people who do not express strong opinions, viewing the situation as distant. From Vietnam. Story 32. Here is my perspective as a Malaysian. In the news, our stance appears to be more natural, not supporting either side. Meanwhile, on social media, a different group exists. On TikTok, there are certain people who support Russia, including those who insist that we should buy the Su-57, which seems rather foolish, to be honest. On Twitter, the majority do not support either side, but there are still a few bots that always spark debates. Lastly, there are older individuals on Facebook who openly support Russia. As for my personal opinion, I do not support either side, but I still keep up with the news of the war in case Russia launches nuclear attacks. Story 33. In my country, India, there is a significant focus on the hypocrisy of the West, accompanied by a general pro-Russia sentiment across the political spectrum. This sentiment is mild on the left and strong to extreme on the right. Some of the more sensationalist news outlets on the right would make Russia Today seem moderate. I consider myself left-leaning, and one point of agreement with my right-leaning friends, who support Prime Minister Modi, is our desire to see Russia win, even if it results in a very unattractive victory. Story 34. Singapore. I didn't think about it since I am on Reddit, but I just realized there really isn't much on it. Story 35. Here in India, people reflect on the war in Russia through novels, as the people in India are avid book lovers. They are reading Cold War mystery thrillers like the Night in Zagreb series, which portray the war in Ukraine in a similar context. This book series now seems prophetic, and people in India have begun to pay more significant attention to Christianity because of it. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.